Graphic novelist Box Brown.
Thank you so much for coming on this beautiful sunny day. I got here like 2 hours ago and I went outside and I was like, no one's going to come to the library because it's too nice. Like, how do you compete with the sun like that? So this is the first, I've been on this little tour talking about the book. The first few events were all like in conversation. So this is the first event where I'm actually reading from the book. So bear with me there. By 3 shows from now, I'll have the whole thing memorized, but I'm making this up as I go along. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the book and then do a little bit a talk, answer hopefully some of what I do is when I do these tours, I do a lot of media and I get a lot of interviews sent my way, and a lot of times they repeat the same questions. So I'm going to answer some of the most commonly asked questions of me. And then I'm going to save a few minutes at the end for Q&A because I often think that that's kind of like the best part of the talk, is talking to you guys. So let me just read a little bit. So this is, so the book focuses on how cannabis, what cannabis is, where it comes from, and how and why it became prohibited in the first place, not just in the United States, but then starting in the United States and then spreading across the entire world. So this part of the story is kind of before cannabis is prohibited nationally. There had been a few cities in the and states that kind of had outlawed cannabis. A lot of border states, anywhere where like a new Mexican population came up, we'd see a state ordinance where cannabis became illegal as a way to kind of push the Mexicans out of the community. So this is some of the powerful people in the area. This is in Louisiana, and this is kind of how like the bubblings of the first talks about national prohibition started. So this is 1920. Dr. Isaac Dowling, president of the Louisiana Board of Health. Sir, there's a story going around you should hear about that marijuana. It's about a lowly musician from a nice white family, hooked on the stuff. Now this fellow was so desperate for marijuana, he attempted to import it by forging a doctor's signature. Forgery is a felony, doctor. No! Yes, that's right. Dr. Dowling had the ear of Governor Parker. Thank you for listening. We've got to do something about this marijuana. It makes the user feel exhilarated, intoxicated. He'll have delirious visions. This is a powerful narcotic. And we ask them later why they do it, and they say, it makes me feel good. And it used to just be Mexicans and Negroes in the red light districts. But this here was a white kid. So then the Governor Parker wrote to Prohibition Commissioner John F. Kramer, Prohibition of Alcohol Commissioner. I'm writing to you about the dangers of marijuana. It's taken over in New Orleans. 2 men were recently found dead after smoking some of this dangerous narcotic. 2 otherwise good men, now dead. It should be illegal, as it makes men crazy and wild. Kramer wrote back, we are too busy with the prohibition of alcohol. Anti-cannabis sentiment spread through New Orleans' medical and legal communities. It's a sexual stimulant, so when people smoke it, crimes like rape and fighting go up, mostly perpetrated by Mexicans. It's also a psychological stimulant, so these users get all jacked up and they need a thrill. Next, they're robbing and assaulting people. You think it's just blacks and Mexicans, but it's spread to our white children. It should be outlawed with booze. By the time the Great Depression hit in 1929, cannabis had popped up in cities where Mexican immigrants found work and settled. But these claims made about cannabis causing violence or overdose deaths were never proven to be true. Even then, Mexican immigrants made up most of the United States agricultural labor force. With the Depression in full swing, white Americans wanted jobs that would have been undesirable in the past. Jobs for America. We are the key men of America. American labor for Americans. I represent the American Coalition Group. We are a large partnership of people that just want to keep America American. The way the founders wanted it to be. Mexicans have come here with this marijuana and they've taken the jobs we need to put food on Americans' tables. And they've been smoking reefer and committing crimes. Americans don't do that. Marijuana that fills our streets is a direct result of this over-immigration of the Mexican and the infiltration of the American workforce. When you smell that smoke, know that it is the smoke of evil. This plant grows in prison yards all across our land now, and it's moving to our children's public schools. We say, go home, Mexican. Take that weed with you. Okay, so this now is Harry Anslinger, who is kind of like the antagonist of the story. I kind of considered Cannabis itself as the protagonist of the story. And if there was an antagonist, it would be this guy, Harry Anslinger, who was involved with prohibition of alcohol, and when that kind of came to a close, he was helping to ramp up prohibition on other drugs, including marijuana, cannabis. And he was pushing for this to become outlawed throughout the entire country. It was his baby, let's say. And he was, but he had to convince a lot of people, and it went through this very long process. And so here he is trying to come up with a uniform drug policy. Gentlemen, it is time to hammer out a uniform drug policy for all the states to tackle the narcotics problem, including marijuana. We want this bill to regulate and tax narcotics throughout the United States. We want this bill to produce revenue, and of course, stem the scourge plaguing our country. The states were not passing the Uniform Drug Act. Damn. Anslinger's career was on the line. He'd have to rewrite it and sell it. Shit. I'm going to have to use every weapon at my disposal. The only way to force this through is to hijack public opinion. We'll fan the flames from the top down. Now that alcohol prohibition is gone, a guy in my industry has to stay employed somehow. I have my reputation to consider. Anslinger's FBN, Federal Bureau of Narcotics, rewrote the Uniform Drug Act. The new version had 14 pages dedicated to cannabis, the previous version having just one. He'd then take the bill on a national tour, aided by his many powerful friends in high places. He started at home in D.C. During a speech to the House Appropriations Committee, he revealed a new focus on cannabis. Marijuana use was thought to be confined to Mexicans and blacks, but we've got a story here that will chill your bones. Poor college students, white girls, just like our own daughters. They find themselves at a party. Sure, young kids, innocent parties. But then colored students end up at the party. And of course these colored students use marijuana on the girls. It's a sexual stimulant after all. These colored students start telling their racial sob stories for sympathy, while letting the marijuana take hold of the girls. The police just harass us all day long. They'll chase us all day. They'll say we were loitering, throw us in jail for 2 days, then try keeping a job when you're missing work like that. That is true, by the way. Just this morning, a white man accused me of stealing his newspaper. That's horrible. The next thing you know, the girls are pregnant. He hit the road, speaking at any place that would have him. Yes, there are marijuana dens in this country. Imagine for me one of these homes downtown in this city, except filled with reefer addicts. Someone on Twitter saw that, posted that panel and said, "This is just my house." This is happening all over this fine nation. You ladies ever try reefer? Follow me. Detroit, Colorado, St. Louis, El Paso. It always ends the same way. The marijuana den turns to a slaughterhouse. The murderer is in a complete daze. I have no memory of anything. I'm not a killer. Right here in America. The reason all these stories are so similar is that they were all fabrications based on popular rumors. It's true. So one of Anslinger's powerful friends was William Randolph Hearst. He owned the nation's largest newspaper chain. He was also notoriously racist, especially towards Mexican immigrants. He used his media power to foment outrage that led to the Spanish-American War. Those methods became known as yellow journalism. Tonk. The media used Anslinger's misconstrued and made-up stories to whip the public into a frenzy over cannabis. These are violent times we live in, Hearst. This is what Anslinger needed to get support for his national drug laws. Tonk. We are going to sell a lot of papers. Oh, so this is now much later in the book. Without giving away the ending too much, they eventually legalized medical marijuana. But this story was very touching to me when I found out about it. I didn't really know too much about it. So a big reason we have legalization now, and the reason we had medical marijuana in the first place has to do with the AIDS crisis. And the fact that the Reagan ignored the AIDS crisis and let it become this a crisis the way it did created the biggest movement that we'd seen in this country since the 60s. And the AIDS movement and the gay rights movement and cannabis legalization movement all kind of joined forces in common struggle. And the common struggle was the AIDS crisis. People were in a situation where they were had not, they were gonna die. They had nothing to cure the situation they were in, but they found that cannabis helped them feel all right while they were in that situation. It helped them eat, helped them sleep. It was the only thing that made them feel good. And so Dennis Perone, one time, was arrested with 4 ounces of cannabis, and they said they thought he was dealing, and he said, well, actually, I think this was in the comic, but Dennis Perone was a pioneer of the medical cannabis movement, and it's because of his efforts that San Francisco was the first made a city ordinance saying that medical cannabis was okay. And then it's that movement spread to the state, and the first medical cannabis laws, state medical cannabis law, was passed in 1996. So this is Dennis Perone's home in San Francisco was busted by cops at 4 a.m. They found 4 ounces of cannabis and arrested Perone. Now, I had sold weed more than a few times, but I wasn't selling it that night. My lover Jonathan needed cannabis to treat his symptoms. He died 2 weeks later. Also, I am an alcoholic. Give me 1 drink and I'll drink 20. For 25 years, I've been able to stay away because of cannabis. I've made it my life's pursuit to make sure that anyone who needs it can gain access to it for any medical reason. Dennis Perone applied this buyer's club concept to cannabis. what he would do is gather up cannabis and make it accessible to people who are in medical need. And these were the first medical cannabis clubs. These were illegal, federally illegal, and statewide illegal, but safe places where AIDS patients and those with other conditions could purchase cannabis without worrying about violence or a scam. At San Francisco General Hospital, a volunteer named Mary Jane Rathbun earned the name Brownie Mary by baking cannabis brownies for patients. She was arrested 3 times for doing so, each time gaining greater attention for cannabis as medicine. Medical cannabis became a national movement thanks to activists like Dennis Perone and Brownie Mary. The power of the AIDS movement and the gay rights movement rallied together with the medical cannabis movement. There were a lot of like-minded individuals. Dennis Perone worked with a group of doctors to author and campaign for California Proposition 215. This would exempt medical cannabis from criminal laws and protect doctors who would recommend cannabis. This is the beginning of the end of the war on drugs. Dennis Perone collected 1.5 million signatures for Prop 215, and it passed with 55% of the vote. In some ways, Dennis was right about Prop 215. In the next 20 years, many other states would legalize medical and even recreational use. But the federal government and others in power would push back. That's how it ends. This last panel, or that last page we were looking at, they just opened. I live in Philadelphia, and we have medical cannabis in Philadelphia, or in Pennsylvania, and they just opened the first patient's lounge in Pennsylvania, and it's in my neighborhood. It's like 2 blocks from my house. It's wild. I was over there. I met this guy at a cannabis event in Philadelphia, and he's like, "I'm opening this thing." And I'm like, "Oh, it's my neighborhood." So I go over there and I start talking to him, and he was one of these guys in the early 2000s setting up the first dispensaries in LA, and he'd been busted by the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration for setting up a medical dispensary kind of before the federal government was ready for this. So I made this comic, finished it 2 years ago, or a year and a half now. But then after I met him, I showed him this book, and I said, that was him, that guy in the bottom right panel. And he was like, I did have long hair back then. I have just like a few things that I wanted to talk about that people often ask me about working on these books. And first thing they ask me is, why do you want to talk about cannabis? And besides the fact that it's in the news every second and every day, I have like a personal connection to it, not just because I am a cannabis enthusiast, but I was arrested for possession of cannabis when I was 16. It was probably like the 6th time I had ever smoked cannabis, like in my life. It was like a traumatic experience. It was scary. We were handcuffed. We were obviously taken to the police station, and then there was court. Juvenile court. The judge is there to kind of humiliate you in front of your parents. That's like part of their job. And so you get to go through that. Then you get to go through probation. All of this is like set up to scare you straight, I guess. It certainly was scary. And I got to see like how people were treated in the legal system, and how I was treated, being from like a somewhat upper class suburb and being white. I was able to administer my own urine test. Other people weren't able to do that. I got 2 months shaved off my probation because I got good grades. But I don't know. I don't know if it was just because I got good grades. But anyway, so I got to see all of this, and I often wonder, like, would I be as interested in cannabis as I am if it wasn't for this, like, crazy traumatic experience associated with it that made it seem so, like, taboo and had a huge impact on my life at the time. It was funny, in my research I found out, so Prop 215 passes in California in 1996. That was the same year that I got arrested. It was also the Clinton administration, and in 1996, cannabis arrests jumped from 200,000 a year to 400,000 a year under Clinton. So while this was going on, I myself got caught up in Bill Clinton's war on drugs. And, like, there was part of me back then that was like, as a teenager, I was filled with angst anyway. But I just, like, couldn't get over the fact that it was, like, not fair. Like, I was looking at, like, other kids my age, 16, 17, there would be, like, high school parties. Cops would come and bust it. Every kid was underage drinking. Like, honestly, like, doing way worse things, like getting into fights, breaking things, all this stuff that I'd see, like, a group of people who were, like, getting high doing. And, like, the cops would just, like, call their parents to come pick them up. There was no, like, handcuffing, no arresting, no court, no probation, none of these things. And so I was always, like, very paying attention to what was going on with cannabis. And so this story, I felt like I always had a cannabis story in me. Even where it came from, even, is after the Andre the Giant book that I did came out, I was thinking about what to do next, because I guess it was like, I didn't know what to do. So I had made, like, a big list of a bunch of different topics that maybe I could talk about. And this was on the list. But we ended up doing a book about Tetris, and then Andy Kaufman. And then after that, my editor came to me and said she was looking at this list that I had made years before and was like, hey, how about this cannabis book? And I think that just shows kind of, like, where my publisher has come in the last 5 years, and, like, where we've come as a society in the last 5 years, because now this big, the publisher is ready to jump in on a cannabis book. So I think that's pretty good. Another thing I get asked a lot about is my research process. So I don't have a degree in journalism, so I feel like I kind of am just not doing anything the right way, just like doing it the Box Brown way to research. But what it is first I kind of, like, collect tons of anything I can get my hands on about what I'm researching, in this case cannabis. You collect it, and you start reading through all this stuff and kind of thinking about where a story might be within this broad history, which goes all the way back to the beginning of time. And then you start looking at, okay, there's plot points here, here's kind of, like, where the story is. And then you go to those plot points and, like, drill down on the research. So now you're like, oh, well, I could put in this part of the story that's from a courtroom situation. And then you could say, oh, well, what was written about that court event? You could find contemporaneous news articles. Then, if you're lucky, for a few parts, I even found, like, court transcripts, which makes my job very easy, or easier at least. And then the research process continues the whole time I'm working and drawing, because drawing takes a long time, and I kind of, like, am drawing one thing while researching another part of the book that might come later. Then when you're done, that's just the first draft. And then so sometimes stuff gets thrown in at the end, some things get pulled out at the end. It's funny, like, at the beginning, you're working on stuff and every page feels, like, incredibly precious, that I would never want to pull a page out. Oh my God, I would work so hard on it. by the end, after you've done 250 pages and you look at it, you're like, oh yeah, these 10 pages are gone. Totally unnecessary. Sometimes I'll get an edit and be like, we have to change this whole page around. And I'd be like, let's just get rid of that page. So there's that whole process too. And sometimes, not so much in this book, but when I was working on the Andy Kaufman book, I got in touch with Andy's writing partner, Bob Zamuda, very late in the process. So some stuff got changed around and added like way at the end, like right before we were going to print. That's always something that happens too. And then, so this book in particular, so when you're trying to figure out how to end, when I'm trying to figure out how to end a book, I always think of it like you're flying a plane and you're like trying to let it down slowly and not like, suddenly finish this book or slam down. So, but with this, like, I didn't want to talk about legalization in this book because it's changing so rapidly. And the book process is so long, even like not just the drawing part and all of that, the creation part, because after that's done, there's like at least a year lead time of production of the book and marketing of the book that takes time. So by the time if this book was about legalization, it would have been about legalization in 2017 or something like that, not legalization now. So for that reason, I was like, where do I end this book? Because it's not going to go up to now. And so I kind of decided to kind of end it right around here, where we start seeing the first steps towards legalization. But also, that made it so I didn't get to talk about some of the things so much that went on here, where there was this like fighting between the federal government and the state government of California. I wish I could have talked about, and a little bit more about the Clinton administration and the Obama administration and W. Bush, but you got to end the book somewhere. And I just saw the first medical laws as like the first step towards the end. If I'm going to dedicate this chunk of time to something, and you only have so much time, so like there's days that come up where I'm like, I think of like some kind of story and I'm like, dang, that would make a cool comic book. But you think of stuff like that all the time, and you wish you could do them all. Like, do you ever hear that song? This is really stupid. I shouldn't bring it up, but have you ever heard that song by Cheap Trick, Surrender? It's like an old song by Cheap Trick, and it's the story in that song is awesome to me because it's like about a kid like finding out that his parents are like people, and it's like a rock song. So every time I hear that, I'm like, I should make a comic about that. But I'm like in the middle of a 250-page book, and I'm on page 50. So it's like there's only so much you can do. So it has to be something that I have like a very strong personal connection with. And it's often I find that the things adults obsess about are kind of all the things that they obsessed about when they were between like 5 and 12. Like I think people often like totally go back to that. It sometimes like becomes like for men, sometimes it's like this passion for like their favorite sports team because it like is their thing that they did with their dad, and then if they're doing it with their kids, it's like this strong, it's like your identity. So the things that I write about have to have something like that in it. There has to be some kind of very strong personal connection to it. And it was like that in the way that Andre was about pro wrestling as a whole, and the Tetris book was about video games as a whole, like this connection to that. And the Andy Kaufman book was kind of just the wrestling thing too. So there might be more wrestling coming one day. So like the first comic I read that like made me think that I could make comics, because, well, I had a weird history. Like I spent like when I was like 10, 11, 12, I like went to the comics shop all the time and like read Marvel comics and drew like superhero dudes and stuff. And then when I started to hit puberty and stuff, I kind of like got out. I kind of saw comics as like a thing for little kids or something, and I was like, gosh, didn't want anyone even to know that I was interested. Same thing with drawing, which is so silly. And so I like didn't draw for a long time. I got back into it in my 20s, and I had not gone to an art school or anything, and felt very far behind anyone like making comics that was my age, because I was just starting out and I felt like I was too old. Even though it was silly things. You can start at any age, you know. But I didn't. So when I got into it when I was 25, it was reading James Kachalka's American Elf, who James was doing daily diary strips, and they were like 4-panel strips, just about something he did that day. And that was like the first time I saw a comic that was like that was just like about regular life. Like you could just make a comic about, didn't have to be like, oh, I'm a robot or a werewolf or something like that. It could just be like about anything. And once that I figured out that was the case, like we could do that, then I was like in love with the medium, and then forget it. It was off to the races after that. Thank you so much for coming on this beautiful day.
This program was recorded on April 6th, 2019 at the Ann Arbor District Library.